I want to thank you for taking the time to attend today's webinar on PO31 vendor returns. And with that, I give you Sarah and Beau.
Thank you, Keith. So I won't keep you all day talking about vendor returns, I promise, but we're really happy to be presenting on this topic to you today. As Keith said, I'm Sarah Concannon, and this is Beau Hunt. We're going to talk to you today about how to take the lemons that life hands you in the form of vendor returns and turn them into lemonade. But first, we'll share a little bit about RPI.
So for those of you that aren't aware, RPI, we specialize in the Lawson practice. We work with new implementations, optimizations. Are we not updating?
We're having a little bit of remote trouble here.
So we are about 90 consultants strong, and here's some fun pictures of some of our consultants. We like to have fun, and we like to have positive projects with our customers. Absolutely. All right, we're on track now.
All right. So today we're going to go over return basics and some best practices. We'll also do some fun facts, little known facts as it turns out by most organizations about vendor returns. We'll go through the different types of claims and also processing replacement POs from the PO31 vendor return screen. Special considerations for inventory, receiving and their role in the process, credits and AP and their role in the process, some reporting and maintenance that Beau's going to share with us, and then we'll take your questions at the end.
All right. Actually, sorry.
So why are PO31 returns important? So you have the basics. You want to track the movement of unwanted goods through the system, and obviously, you want to get your money back or secure a replacement product. But there's more that PO31 offers you than just, those two major items. It can also help you track recalls, which can be really important, especially if someone is coming in and auditing you on that, which does happen. We all love getting audited. But, as long as you make sure that you have all that background information, you'll be prepared. PO31 returns are a great way to help tie all of that in together and close out your recalls and make sure that you have that information available to you. There's also damages. Maybe you have certain items that are showing up damaged all the time, and you want to consider switching over to a different version of that product, or you want to make sure that you're able to report that to the vendor because it may, there may be a flaw with that product. Who knows? But it's an excellent way to keep track of that you probably wouldn't have access to otherwise. You can also create vendor scorecards. You can see, how many different returns you're having to process for a particular vendor. Most of you probably have a primary vendor that you do most of your business with. So most of your returns are likely to be with them, but you can kind of get a sense of turnaround time and all sorts of other metrics that you could use to create a vendor scorecard for returns.
Yeah, and I think that's a good one that nobody really looks at. So when we look at kind of scoring vendors, we're looking at turnarounds, we're looking at fill rates, but nobody really thinks about kind of where vendor returns fit into that. So
exactly. And also clinical product trials. So, when you're trying out a new product, you're not always getting that full quantity for free. So you want to be able to kind of track how that's going back. It may not necessarily be coming in initially on a PO. It may be dealt with using an expense invoice. And, this is a great way to track the return of that too, because sometimes that can get really complicated if you're not finding a way to maintain those through the system.
So, to make sure that you have a good process for vendor returns, one of the most important things is to make sure you have a documented process. So many people, so many customers that we work with, we go in and it's a very loose situation. The roles and the delineation of responsibilities is not really set. So putting together a process, and there's a few different ways you could manage this. Typically the requester is going to initiate this. They're the ones that know that a product needs to be returned for whatever reason. The buyer is going to be the overall process owner for this. So throughout, they're going to need to create that vendor return. They're going to be the ones reaching out for the RMA information, getting all of that, and they're going to authorize that. Now, we want to make sure that they put information in, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides, as far as documenting good information to make sure that the process can be followed through. And once the product goes to the dock, this is where things sometimes get a little confusing. So it's best practice if you're able to have your dock personnel actually marking it as shipped, putting in that tracking information. Typically what we do see is the buyer ends up, that responsibility falls to the buyer. And again, if we can get that and get your receiving folks in the PO31, taking some responsibility for that, that's going to help the process run much smoother. And then the other area where things kind of lose focus is tracking the actual credit that's coming back in and coordinating between purchasing and AP. So you want to have a good documented process and some reports that are available for both supply chain and AP to work on to close everything out.
Absolutely. That's where we see a lot of pain points. This is one of those things where the screen can do a lot for you. It can allow you to track a lot of information, but everything going smoothly and avoiding those pain points and gaps is heavily dependent on having a good, solid process and well-defined roles and responsibilities within that process where all of the players have at least a basic understanding of the other, key participants' role and what their expectations are also. So this is real basic, but it can also be a big point of confusion, which we've seen at some clients. So we're just going to talk really quickly through return record statuses. Starts out really obvious. You perform the add function, the status is added. All right, great, good. So far, so good.
We have a return.
Yeah, exactly. You authorize the record. The status is authorized by vendor. All right, great. Then we get to shipped. Once the record has been shipped, the status becomes waiting for vendor action. And that really throws a lot of people off because they don't know what that means.
Right.
Some people confuse that with authorized. So it's important that people recognize that the shipped action is tied to the record being in waiting for vendor action. And that action refers to the expectation that the vendor is creating a credit and will be sending a credit to you for AP to process. The other part of this that's a little bit confusing to some is that whether the action that you perform at the end, if you need to manually close or cancel the record, the status is closed. There is no cancel status. So whether or not
it always goes to close.
Right, exactly. So whether or not it's a close or cancel action you're performing, that record is going to go into a status of closed.
All right, so we talked a little bit about documentation. Using PO31, using the screen or the fields that are in there to help you manage this best. Definitely reason codes are important. We want to understand why we're returning this product, and reason codes are really the only way we can identify that. So having good reason codes built out and actually using them consistently, and then pulling those into some of the reporting that we're going to be talking about is key to having a good solid returns process.
Yep, and that's how you're going to follow those best practice recommendations of tracking recalls and things like that. You would want to build in a recall reason code, broken, or damaged, anything like that, that's really gonna make sure that you're backing up that record with the reason that you're processing the return in the first place.
I think reference number is probably the biggest one here.
But before we skip on to that, It's important to note that reason codes are not necessarily mandatory. It depends on how you have that set up in Lawson. We do recommend that you make that mandatory because with all the different steps that are involved in completing that PO31 process, it's easy to miss. And you know, sometimes you're looking to get the record processed and out the door, you're trying to contact the vendor and get the RMA. It's easy to skip if that's an option. So you can go into PO01.1 and there's a flag there for reason code required, and you can set that to yes, and you can make your buyers do it.
Yes. Enforce compliance.
Exactly.
All right, so reference, this one's really key, and because the biggest gap we have in this process is AP being able to successfully match the credit back to the return. So using the reference number, best practice would be to put the PO number in as the reference number so that AP, when they can get that credit, they can look at the reference, look at the PO, and actually find what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And it helps you out too if you're the person processing these PO31 returns, because once you have added the return, you'll see here the create from PO field, that clears out. So if you're just looking at the header information in PO31, you don't have that original PO number to refer to anymore easily at your fingertips unless you're also using it as the reference number. The reference number is a free form field, so you know, data entry is important. And you don't have a similar option within the PO company setup to make that mandatory. So this is something where you want to just periodically check that this is occurring, that this process is being followed, and that this is a documented step in your returns process.
And having some of the reporting we talked about, or we're going to talk about, makes managing that compliance a lot easier.
Absolutely.
So return ship via. This is a good one because you want to know how you're getting that return back. If you're working with your prime vendor, maybe you're not sending it out via FedEx or UPS. Maybe their truck's coming and picking it up, and just having visibility into that so that you can work these, look for statuses, and understand this is an important field just to keep on top of the process.
Yep, there are certain vendors or products where you're often going to have the rep on site, and maybe they are frequently just picking up directly from the department that product that needs to go back. And if that's not being documented here, hopefully in some sort of standardized way that you've established as part of your process, it can be very difficult, especially if it's, you know, maybe a month down the road, you haven't received the credit, you're trying to follow up on that, and you have no tracking number because it didn't go out UPS or FedEx. You don't have a driver's signature because it didn't get picked up by a delivery truck from your distributor. You know, if you don't have that information there, it's very difficult to go back and say, oh, well, I think maybe Joe Rep picked it up sometime in April from so-and-so. You have nothing to back that up. So you really do want to make sure that this is documented accurately and consistently in the system.
Yep, absolutely. And then following that up with commenting. Comments are available in PO31. Use them. You know, document all your processes as you have interactions with the vendor. Document what's happening there, because this is kind of your one-stop shop that AP and supply chain can work through to make sure that these returns are processed and the credits are applied properly.
Absolutely. Years ago, I was training with someone named Erica, and she had done something that was, you know, a good best practice for her process, and she said, you know, I love past Erica. She's always looking out for future Erica. And that's what you're doing when you're adding good comments to PO31, because some vendors you call up, you get the RMA immediately. It's a quick and easy process. Other ones, you practically have to beg them for it. You have to call and initiate the process. They're not ready to give it to you at the time for whatever reason. They have to check with the rep. It can turn into a 2 weeks long process just to get the RMA. And depending on how many vendor returns you're processing and how else you may be trying to capture and maintain that information, you're not going to know a week after you had that initial phone call exactly what you talked about, who you spoke with, why you don't have the RMA yet, you're really doing your future self a favor
Absolutely.
by adding detailed comments. So we'll do some fun facts about returns with our happy little lemon right here. He's so cute, I love him.
You never explained the lemon life part of the
I did.
Okay.
I did.
Sorry.
You missed it.
Trouble then.
So, return records can't be closed or canceled until they are in waiting for vendor action status, which is, if we go back to that status overview, what happens when you perform the shipped action.
So what do you do when you're backlogged? So we have customers maybe that this hasn't been maintained very well in the past, and so they have a bunch of returns that are sitting in that created status. Like how do we help that out?
So you definitely want to do some analysis. Your options are to either delete the record, which will be okay in some circumstances, or you can actually use a custom self-contained workbook to move the record through into the closed or canceled status that will allow you, into the waiting for vendor action status that will then allow you to close or cancel the record.
And the challenge with that is just in add-ins, those action codes of shipped, those aren't available in the add-ins UI.
Right.
But you can do that as an upload. Again, it's through a self-contained workbook, and you can push these records through to do that cleanup.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been able to help a few clients with that and clean up a lot of past sins.
Yes, so we'll revisit this a little bit in the reporting and maintenance section of the presentation at the end. A lot of these things will kind of be circling back to throughout the presentation because this is a big one. If you don't have that maintenance piece as part of your process, you may end up with vendor return records that have been open since you started using Lawson, and that's obviously not ideal. Let's hope you're not in that position, but there are tools that can help you accomplish that cleanup if you are. Another fun fact, a return can't be canceled if a credit has been received against the return. It can be closed, but it can't be canceled. And it may not make initial sense, but if you think a little bit more about it, if you've already gotten money back from the vendor, some part of that return was successful, so you can't cancel it in the system. Credits also can't be applied to a return unless the record is in waiting for vendor action status. So this is again an opportunity potentially to use that self-contained workbook option to move the record through into the final status, because this is a big hang up between purchasing and AP. I would venture to say it's a little known fact, and purchasing often doesn't have visibility to how much additional time this can create in the process of applying the credit to a vendor return record. And it may just lead to AP getting frustrated and processing the credit without including the return number, which is not something you want, because then the vendor return stays open indefinitely until you recognize what happened and close it manually. So this is a really good point of awareness.
And it just goes back to having that process, because that's where it breaks down. It's a straightforward process, but if steps are not followed, it gets hung up, and this is where we end up with messes. So just
Absolutely. And last but not least, applying a credit to the vendor return will not automatically close the record unless the credit value that you have received matches the expected return value to the penny. If you haven't accounted for restocking fee or a shipping fee or some sort of depreciation of the materials, if it's 5 cents off, that record is just going to continue to stay open, because as far as Lawson is concerned, you're expecting more money. So this is a really important one, and again, we'll be revisiting this a little bit in reporting and maintenance.
All right, so what are the types of vendor returns that we can process? You know, obviously the most common one is going to be a credit memo. We're looking to get a credit back from the vendor, and we want to make sure that that gets applied to the return. You can also do a chargeback, and one of the kind of unique things about doing a chargeback is as soon as you mark it as shipped, that does close the return because there's no action for AP to take. As it applies to that return.
Right,
So
because you're saying to the system, we're gonna apply this credit against what we owe the vendor.
Yep.
So, you know, so long as you have a balance that you owe the vendor, the record's gonna close automatically. I know from experience that a lot of organizations have trouble with chargeback, kind of managing that relationship with the vendor. So we're not gonna get too much into chargebacks today because, you know, most of our clients are processing returns for credit memos for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of the challenges with chargebacks, it's the same as when you do the original value of the return is you don't really know what the amount is, right? So it's chargeback is system generated based on the PO unit cost unless you override it. So it's going to be wrong most of the time.
Most of the time it is.
And then the label is going to be this system generated number. So conceptually, that system generated credit memo sounds good, but you need to actually know how much it's for.
Right.
Yeah, before you push it through, absolutely.
It's like, oh, that's great in theory, and then in practice, it all
Yeah, it falls down pretty quickly.
goes nuts. Yeah.
All right, and then you can also do a no charge. But one note is you do have to have the replace goods flag set to yes to use the no charge.
And we'll get a little bit more into replacement product right now. Oh, so this is the wrong screenshot first. My apologies, everybody. But luckily I didn't overlap them, so we're good to go. So here, the vendor claim type is still being set to credit memo, but as Beau just said, this would mandatorily be yes as enforced by the system if you have chosen no charge as the vendor claim type. But if you do want PO31 to assist you in creating a new purchase order for the replacement of those goods, it's kind of, it's all built in there. It's a really nice, easy way to do it. And it ties the replacement PO to the return record, which is in turn tied to the original PO. And it just makes sure that everything is nicely tied together in the system so that you can follow the trail of what's going on here.
And it's important to make sure the vendor knows about that replacement PO because that's
Yes.
going to clean up your process. When that return product comes in, the receiving staff is going to know what to do with it. They're going to see a PO number and they're actually going to be able to apply that to that new PO that Lawson generates for you.
Yes, so that's something you want to build into your process, the individual contacting the vendor to arrange the return and get that RGA or RMA number. You're going to want to be very clear if you are arranging for a replacement product that there is a different PO number that you want associated with that. So you would choose that Y flag here for replaced goods. The system will make you enter a replacement date, and it's going to use that date in the generation of the new PO for that replacement product to be received on. And so this is how that's going to look. It will provide, once you've authorized it and performed the authorized action, it will provide you with the replacement PO number that the replacement goods are going to come in on. And you get this nice little message. This is PO20 here in the second screenshot. And it's going to give you the little note there that this PO has been reserved for returns.
A point of clarification here. We have a question on whether you said that selecting Y for replaced goods will auto create a new PO. Will it automatically create a new PO?
Yes. Upon performing the authorized action, this new PO for the replacement goods will automatically be created.
It gets created and it gets put in this reserve for vendor returns. So we're going out to PO20 here to check on that, but that's not an action that you need to take.
Right.
Simply by authorizing it in PO31, it's going to do this for you, and it's going to give you that PO number in your replacement PO field
But is
on
it
PO31.
basically going to get issued and able to get received again, or is it in a
It is.
sort of
It's
status?
once you go into authorize it. This reserve for vendor return status is in a state that you can return against, or sorry, that you can do a receipt against.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, but that's a great point. I think what you're getting at, or maybe what this question asker is getting at, is this going to go out to the vendor? And that is something that you have to be sensitive to. You may need to build that into your process if this is something that you do frequently, to just check the issue status for the PO or for that vendor, to make sure that they don't receive it and think it's a new order, even though you've already set it up when you were authorizing the return with them.
So, I mean, just a quick way to do that, for anybody listening, is you could have a PO remit to with a different, do not issue, and then you can default the PO remit to from the vendor return, almost guaranteed. Yeah. Another quick question for you here. Can you add comments or additional information to the PO? Now I'm guessing this is from the return that they're asking, because obviously you can go to PO20 and add the comments.
So I'm not sure, I don't believe the comments from PO31
are going to carry over.
Carry through to
so,
PO20, but you can certainly add them in PO20.
Right.
All right, great questions, everybody. So we're going to move on to some inventory special considerations.
So yeah, with inventory product, there's definitely a few extra wrinkles that we want to work through, and a lot of it is just about timing and really understanding what's happening in each status of a PO31 vendor return as it relates to on-hand inventory. So what you want to be aware of is your stock on hand. So when you create the return, your stock on hand remains in inventory. This could potentially be a problem because we want to get that item off the shelf. We don't want people to try to request it. We want to show that it's not in inventory. But the reality is, until you mark that return as shipped, the inventory, if you don't adjust it out, is going to sit there in your inventory location. So it's when you mark it as shipped that Lawson will go ahead and decrement that inventory. So again, we want to understand what to do, and there's a few different ways you can handle this. Again, what we can do, one method is we can move that inventory. So as soon as we create the inventory return, move it to a hold bin. We want to be aware of that. Again, it's all about process, so that, because when you mark that product as shipped, it's not going to decrement it from your hold bin, it's going to decrement it from the main inventory. So you'd want to adjust it back in, ship the product, and then that's going to decrement that inventory like you want it to. Again, this is just an area that a lot of customers get hung up on, because it's understanding what's really happening and what's the best process to make sure that your inventory is reflected correctly with what's on the shelf.
Yep, and it's definitely something that is going to vary a lot from organization to organization. Some areas are just physically really close together as far as inventory and the receiving area that would be shipping the product out, and so there really is no appreciable problematic gap between when that product is physically coming off the shelf and when the return record would be moving that quantity out of the available stock on hand. Others, you may have some physical distance between the two, or it may come down to the particular type of return that's being processed. If you have a huge recall where a product has been returned from requesting departments and has come back into inventory, you've processed requisition returns, and then you kind of need to sequester it. You don't want it to be on the shelf, obviously, that recalled product available to pick, but you need to make sure that you're stock on hand information is still accurate. So, you need to have a way of setting that aside so that it doesn't show up as available in the system, but it would be prior to you being able to perform that shipped function.
Absolutely. So the other thing, this is where the difference comes in. So we talked about earlier how regardless of if you cancel or close a vendor return, the status at the end of the day is closed. What actually happens when you cancel a vendor return is it's typically not automatically adjusted back in, but there is a flag where you can do that. So if this flag is set to yes, if you cancel a vendor return and it's inventory product, it's going to put that inventory back on the shelf.
Yes.
So again, it's just understanding it, and then you can build your processes around it.
Yep, and we're talking to that a little bit more here. So this is a flag that you can set up back in our good old PO company parameters here. So you can have this set company-wide that you want to return stock to inventory upon cancel. We do recommend generally that be set to yes, because if it's not going back to the vendor, it's got to be going somewhere, and otherwise it's kind of essentially disappearing into the ether. A point of consideration though, like we've been talking about, it's all too easy with vendor returns to end up in a situation where the organization has a lot of old records that are not in accurate statuses, that are just hanging around out there. And you do need to be sensitive when going through that cleanup process to how you're going to handle any returns that are old and hanging out there and need to be resolved that are for inventory product.
Because we don't want to magically put a bunch of inventory on the shelf that does not exist.
Yeah, if you have this set to yes and you just go in there willy-nilly,
cancel them.
You're going to end up with a lot of stock on hand and accuracy headaches. So that's just a point to consider. This flag is also present within PO31 itself. So that can be set there as well. So there are two different
There's the
areas to
default,
consider.
and then you can override it in PO31.
Exactly. All right. Now we'll talk a little bit about receiving. I think receiving kind of flies under the radar for a lot of people's return processes, but they're a pretty crucial part of the process as a whole. They may be the initiator of returns for damaged or mispicked product that comes in. They're responsible for that last open status of the vendor returns process typically, which is that shipped action that we talked about. They're the gatekeepers for goods leaving the facility usually. They benefit from a good understanding of the process and the reporting tools that are available to them. I'm sure, as a lot of you know, the dock is a hectic place. They may just have a shelf that they only check when they get an email or some paperwork in or someone pings them about something. They're often very busy and doing a lot of other things and, don't have time to think about, well, gee, on a regular basis, I should probably go check and see if there's anything on the return shelf. Or maybe they've shipped it out and they just forgot to follow up and perform that shipped action and loss. And it happens a lot. It's really easy. It's an easy step to miss.
Right. And I think what's interesting as we talk to a lot of customers and we go out and we visit customers, we talk to the receiving folks and we say, so what's your vendor returns process? And they say, oh, great, here's my vendor return form. And in their world, it's a complete paper process.
Yes.
And you say, and you start talking about the process in Lawson, and they said, you can process vendor returns in Lawson? And it's just that awareness. It's definitely, you want to get receiving involved in that because they're a crucial component to that, and having their input, making sure we got good data on when stuff's truly leaving, getting your tracking numbers documented. It's going to help this be a success for your organization.
Yes. Yep. They need to feel ownership over that part of the process, and they need to be an active participant in the maintenance process. So we'll talk a little bit about returns not handled by receiving. This is another big pain point for a lot of organizations. Sometimes the vendor will provide a call tag that is just going to be sent to the requesting department, and they're going to have FedEx or UPS pick it up right from there, which is great, seems really convenient, but you have to consider who is performing the shipped function in that case, and who is responsible for documenting the tracking number, and making sure that all of these steps that are required for this process to go smoothly are still occurring. Same with that vendor rep pickup, which again kind of goes back to why the return ship via is important to document, because you have the same problem there, and potentially even more problems because the vendor in that case doesn't have a call tag number or a tracking number to tie to this return. Also, cases where the product is to be discarded per the vendor, you may call and say, I got a case of 100 plastic bedpan liners and they're all cracked. And the vendor's going to say
don't send those back to me.
Yeah, that was $15 worth of product. We don't want them back. You can just throw them away. So how is that going to be documented? Who is going to perform all of the functions that need to happen for the record to ultimately close out properly when you have these slight deviations from your standard process?
That happen commonly.
Yes. And we'll talk a little bit about the credits and AP side here, which circle back to some of our best practices. So I'm kind of making the assumption that a lot of you joining us today are joining us from purchasing rules. So you are maybe unfamiliar with what the AP processors are seeing when they are processing a credit memo in AP 20. On the miscellaneous tab here within AP 20, there is a return number field. If they happen to have that number,
of course they're always going to have that, right?
Which they never will. They can just plug it in here. However, if they don't, and they almost never will because it's not something that you provide to the vendor, it's not something the vendor's going to give you on the credit memo, what they will need to do is drill around in this field, and these are their options. And if you'll note, as you review these, PO number is not among them.
Crazy.
They can't search by the PO number for the return that this credit is for. Think about how difficult that is. It's really tough for AP. And that's what makes the entry of that accurate reference number when you're first creating the PO31 record so important, because they could search by vendor. If it's a vendor that you don't have very many returns from, that's great, but if your primary distributor is Cardinal or Medline and they have to pull up every return that's open in the system for Cardinal or Medline, it's a nightmare.
That credit is not going to get applied to the return.
They're not going to know the create date. They're not going to know the return number. And they're almost certainly, in a perfect world, our return value would always match the credit value that we get in. But we know that doesn't happen nearly as often as we would like. So the only practical option here is the reference number. And that's why it's so important to reference the PO number as the reference number. So now, some fun reporting and maintenance that Beau's going to handle here.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry, I'm going to just do real quick, and hopefully we'll move through the reporting quick, but we got a question here on the credits, and I just want to add that very often they do have to track down the PO number and drill into it or something. It's the only way they can do it. So it is one of the things that I think hurts the process, is that it is a hassle from an AP perspective. It is definitely not a seamless process. I have a question here, and I'll let you guys, in case there's something I don't know, how do we handle a credit that's just for pricing? So it's not really a return, but AP is requesting a return number to process the credit. Now, as far as I know, a return is always a quantity-based transaction,
Yes.
right? So, so you will not have a return to match
for like from a service or something.
Well, no, like a pricing change, I think is what they're talking about. So there's some credit and rebill processes that get really complicated.
Yes.
Leaving those aside, just quick best practice. Best way to process those credits is to put the PO number in the PO field. It'll be drillable from the PO, and then process as a regular credit, and then use the distribution GL information that's on the PO, as long as it's not an inventory item. It's an inventory item, you don't want to code it to the inventory account. Sorry.
Yes,
We also have, we're T-9 minutes, so
Okay.
for whatever that's worth.
Excellent. Yeah, I think we'll talk about reporting here. So really the only canned report that's available for this outside of doing, your own queries is the PO31 report. Unfortunately, some of the detail that would be helpful is lacking here. So what we recommend typically is doing some custom reporting. So what we got here, this is a return status by detail. You would want to look at it, and you could look at past close ones if you're researching historical things, but you could also filter this report down to just look at them that are in your open status types. So, purchasing is going to want to be monitoring the stuff that's sitting in added and understand, oh, we haven't authorized this. We need to get an RMA for this. That's a work queue that they could work. The shipped ones, we've marked it as shipped. A good thing we can also use this report for is to double check that we're getting the data we want. It's shipped. We're not using the return via on certain field or on certain returns. We're not documenting the tracking number. But then this is also going to give you that information. So where we talked about earlier, AP, they could use this report and look at only the returns that are sitting and waiting for vendor action, and this is their queue. So if they have to do some research, rather than trying to sift through the ocean on finding their POs, this is a targeted area that they can use. And again, this helps you close out. Let's keep those records that are out there for a period of time. We have all of our dates here, so you can sit there and work it and make sure that your returns that are in the statuses that they are there for a reason, and that's valid.
Right, exactly, because it's all too easy to start your vendor return, you add it, you get a phone call for some fire that you need to put out, or someone comes over to give you a slice of cake for Joanne's birthday, and you forgot that you added it. There's really nothing that's ever going to jump out at you to remind you that you added that record, and those can just sit open forever.
Yep.
Forever. Unless you have a report in place that's going to help you track it, and there's some expectations around who's monitoring that and how frequently. And as you see in this particular report, Beau built in the dates for each of the statuses that apply to each of these records, and that's great because you can actually use that to kind of you could create like a monthly buyer scorecard for how they're doing following up on returns. You could create kind of service expectations about how long you would reasonably expect a record to sit in the added status before it's been authorized, and then again in the authorized status before it's been shipped. And that last one I just mentioned could be really instrumental in following up with receiving, because if something was authorized, the paperwork was provided by the vendor, or the RMA was provided by the vendor, but 3 weeks have gone by, and according to the system, it hasn't gone out the door. Maybe it actually has, but receiving just got really busy and forgot to perform that action. And so this can really help you button up your process, keep a handle on all of those open records that are out there, and make sure that they get resolved.
The other nice thing you can do, so we've got both side by side the PO31 return value and the credit that has been received against it. So remember, if that return credit doesn't match to the penny, this is going to sit there out there waiting open. So I know it's hard to see these, but we have some here where we had a return value for $80, we got a credit for $75. Maybe there was a $5 restocking fee. That's going to sit out there. So this gives you that visibility so you can close those records out. Right,
exactly. Because like we said, unless it matches to the penny, it's not going to close automatically. And this was something that I had asked Beau to include in the report for a recent customer, because they were going to set up some thresholds about what it wasn't worth for them to follow up on.
Right.
So basically, you can say to your buyers, if we receive 85% or higher of the expected credit, just close it out. It's not worth it for us to spend our time chasing after that extra 15%. This is probably all we're going to get. Meanwhile, if you're expecting a $4,000 credit and you get 25% in, something you're going to want to follow up on with the vendor. What gives? There's more coming, right, guys? So it's really helpful. So that's all we have for you today. Oh, these are supposed to be gifts.
They're not moving.
Oh, no.
It's our webinar laptop. Sometimes it can't handle everything. I'm
Can't
very.
handle Beyonce.
Wait.
You gotta let me speak to this, even though
please.
the gifts aren't working.
Go for it.
So when I wrote up the description for this webinar that was gonna go out so that all of you could sign up for it, Keith gave me the feedback that I should try not to lead with negative things, because I said, no one likes vendor returns, but they're a necessary evil, something along those lines. But if you don't have the process in place, vendor returns are a big pain point for so many of our customers, and a lot of people just hate them. And it's because the process isn't in place or roles and responsibilities aren't defined. I think we've provided a really good foundation of a lot of the areas where there's opportunity to close gaps and improve your process. And hopefully, if this was how you feel about vendor returns before the webinar, this would be the after, and you don't get to see it, but in the first clip from Beyonce's video for Lemonade, there's a tie-in here. She's smashing her car window, and in the second one, she's twirling around joyously. So
hopefully this presentation
yes.
will help everyone twirl around joyfully when they look at vendor returns. I mean, it's been an ongoing problem for a lot of customers, especially in the healthcare industry. I myself remember many years ago when I helped clean some of these up. I'm so glad that we have people that actually know what they're talking about nowadays. Very helpful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.